Hello, I'm Joe O'Brien. You're watching ABC News 24. Just breaking into that bulletin there because the Prime Minister has just begun a media conference in Sydney.
Have been given, and we can now look forward to the first flights, Minister?
In the mid-2020s.
Mid-2020s. So it's now very close to realisation. This is a critical element of our focus on ensuring strong economic growth and strong jobs growth right across the nation, but in particular here in Western Sydney. You know, in this city, we have now a situation where 2 million people who live in Sydney are further away, are closer to Badgerys Creek than they are to the current Sydney airport at Mascot. So we're in a situation where this airport is needed. It will drive jobs, it will drive investment, it will drive industry, it will drive technology. It will deliver 9,000 new jobs to Western Sydney by the early 2030s and 60,000 in the long term. It will become a catalyst for investment and industry in Western Sydney. That is where Sydney's growth is. Western Sydney is and will be the 4th largest city in Australia in its own right. It is a massive element, a massive contributor to our national economy, and it needs more jobs. Too many people who live in Western Sydney have to commute into the city to work. We need to create more opportunities for employment, for investment in Western Sydney. We're already doing that with massive investments in infrastructure in Western Sydney already, all of which are contributing to this great development of the Western Sydney Airport. So the approval has been given, the plan is being determined, and I'll invite the Minister to say some more about this great development, and then there are a couple of other matters I'll address before we go to questions.
Well, thank you, Prime Minister. As you rightly say, the making of the airport plan today means that from a regulatory perspective, Western Sydney Airport is now cleared for takeoff, and that's enormously important for several reasons. Firstly, Sydney needs additional aviation capacity. The joint study into the aviation needs of Sydney, completed under the previous government, found that Kingsford Smith Airport would run out of available slots by 2027 and would run out of available capacity by the mid to late 2030s. Sydney is Australia's international aviation gateway, so it's so important for economic and social reasons that we have the additional aviation capacity that Western Sydney Airport at Badgerys Creek will provide. The second reason this is so important, as the Prime Minister has said, is because it will offer convenient new travel options for people living in Western Sydney, and some 2 million people will now find that Western Sydney Airport is closer to them than Kingsford Smith Airport. And the third reason why this is so important is because of its economic and jobs potential. Around the world, airports are proven job generators. We expect that the airport itself will generate around 9,000 jobs by the early 2030s. But even more important than that is the economic catalyst as the airport attracts businesses and employment to areas around the airport, and that's why the Turnbull government is working so closely with the Baird government in New South Wales on the land use planning issues, and through the Western Sydney City deal, that's the framework through which we're working to maximise the broader economic impact of Western Sydney Airport, delivering a very significant benefit to Western Sydney, where more than 1 million people will be living in addition to the 2 million people who are already there over the next 20 years, but also an economic benefit for Sydney and for the nation.
Yes, thank you, Paul. On two other matters. Firstly, earlier today, I was delighted to congratulate Bill English, New Zealand's new Prime Minister, on his appointment and his succession to John Keys, who has recently, as you know, announced his retirement. Bill is a very good friend of Australia, very well known in Australia. He's done an outstanding job in charge of New Zealand's finances during the time of the Key government, and I know that he will continue the very successful, very collaborative relationship that we have between Australia and New Zealand. So we're all delighted that Bill has become Prime Minister. On a sadder note, on a very sad note, in fact, I condemn the attacks, the terrorist attacks in Istanbul and Cairo over the weekend. As you know, there was a terrorist attack in the St Mark's Coptic Cathedral in Cairo over the weekend, and 25 persons were killed, many more injured. Another terrorist attack in Istanbul also over the weekend, 38 killed and many more injured as well. We stand shoulder to shoulder with our friends, with our allies around the world in the fight against extremism, the fight against terrorism. These crimes are despicable, they are cowardly, and the Australian government, and I know the Australian people, condemns them.
Prime Minister, critics of the decision today say that the announcement is premature. No flight paths arranged, planned, no noise abatement plan in place, no fuel lines announced either to service this airport. Do you think you've rushed ahead too quickly here?
Well, I'll let the Minister answer that one, but the answer is, if anything, the decision, the need for an airport in Western Sydney has been screamingly obvious for many years, and it is a great credit to the coalition under Tony Abbott's Prime Ministership and then my Prime Ministership that we have got on with the job and we've got the airport plan approved. All the regulatory approvals are done. Now that's the first. We're getting on with the job. This airport will be built. Tens of thousands of jobs will be created. It will transform the economic opportunities in Western Sydney. But, Minister.
Well, thanks, Prime Minister. I think it's worth making the point that we've gone through a very careful and thorough process in relation to particularly the development of the environmental impact statement. There was a draft environmental impact statement issued last year, out for community consultation, some 5,000 submissions received, carefully assessed. A final environmental impact statement issued this year, and just recently Environment and Energy Minister Josh Frydenberg cleared that and attached a series of conditions which are now reflected in the airport plan. They address a whole range of matters, things like biodiversity, noise, water quality, air quality, cultural heritage, both Aboriginal and European. So a very comprehensive framework. I also want to make the point in relation to airspace planning and the flight paths, which is obviously an issue of acute community interest. There's a number of processes underway. Firstly, we've announced we'll be establishing what we call the Forum on Western Sydney Airport, which will be a community consultation mechanism, and indeed I'm in the process of inviting local members of parliament and councils to nominate representatives to that forum. Now, very importantly, the environmental impact statement sets out a set of indicative flight paths, but we now go through a very detailed flight path planning process. Presently, Brisbane Airport is going through a similar process in relation to a new runway that will open in the next year or two. And as an indication, that process has taken several years because there needs to be very detailed consultation with airlines, with the community, on the possible flight paths and on the impacts of them. But the government has announced some key principles which must be complied with in determining those flight paths. And perhaps the most important of those, or a couple of them to single out, firstly, we have said that there will be no single point merge over any residential community. And secondly, we have said that during evening hours, aircraft must both take off to and land from the southwest, the relatively unpopulated areas of the southwest, where safe to do so, which indications are will be more than 80% of the time. So that's very important, and that's one of the dividends of the fact that Badgerys Creek has been set aside as a location for Sydney's second airport since at least the mid-1980s. So there's been extensive restrictions on development around it since that time, and the environmental impact statement contains conditions, including one in relation to that preferred mode of operation to the southwest. So in a whole range of detailed ways, we have been listening to community concerns here and sought to address them, either in conditions that are in the environmental impact statement and in turn reflected in the airport plan, or in ongoing processes, for example, in settling the final flight paths.
There's lots of plans for road infrastructure around the airport, but the rail plans appear to be lacking. Why is that?
Well, I don't think it's right that they're lacking. The airport is being planned to be rail ready. What that means is there will be a station box excavated. That's the space for a station. There will be a pathway, a corridor for the rail designed across the airport location, and then all the terminal and other facilities will be built around that. At the same time, the Turnbull government is working with the Baird government in New South Wales on a scoping study into the rail needs of Western Sydney and Western Sydney Airport. That's asking the question, what would the right route be for a rail connection to the airport? When should it be built? How much will it cost? How should that be paid for? There was a community consultation process on that in response to a discussion paper earlier this year. The final report will come to the two governments during the first half of next year. And the Prime Minister has issued the challenge in a speech earlier this year. He wants that scoping study to advise the two governments, can there be rail at the airport when it opens, or if not, then how soon afterwards?
So is it possible that the airport will in fact open with no rail links linking to the rest of Sydney?
Well, the airport, as I've mentioned, is being designed to be rail ready, and there's a detailed public policy process in relation to what the options are. Of course, it's also worth making the point that there is a $3.6 billion Western Sydney infrastructure plan, which is developing and delivering excellent ground connectivity, road connectivity to the airport, including the Northern Road being upgraded to 4 lanes for its entire length, and the M12 will be a new freeway running from the M7, connecting to the airport and therefore connecting the airport into Sydney's freeway network. And of course, over those road networks, there will be public transport connectivity from the outset. And separately, of course, we do have a very detailed process underway in relation to rail options. Where we are is that what we're announcing today can be thought of as, in effect, the equivalent of the development approval on a house. So that's the planning approval for the project to get underway. That's terribly important. At the same time, as is well known, Sydney Airport Corporation Limited, the parent company of Kingsford Smith Airport, has what's called a right of first refusal. They have that contractually, and that means they have to be given the right to build the airport. There have been very extensive consultations between the government and Sydney Airport Corporation Limited over more than 2 years. Extensive exchange of documents, and what now needs to happen is that before the end of the year, the government expects to issue to Sydney Airport Corporation what's called a notice of intention. That's the formal legal document. In fact, it will be comprise about 1,000 pages of contractual documentation that's been developed between the government and Sydney Airport over the last couple of years. It will then be a question for Sydney Airport Corporation as to whether they want to take up their right, which they would do if they chose to do so by accepting the notice of intention, and they'll have about 4 months to do that from the time they receive the notice of intention.
Prime Minister, how confident are you that bipartisan support for the airport can be sustained over the long term in terms of state and federal government?
Well, we are confident, but you can't take that for granted. It's we have seen the airport plan announcement welcomed by the Labor Party today, with a few sort of snipes on the way through, as you'd expect from them. But this is really critical to the economic future of Western Sydney. I mean, this is where Sydney's growth is going to be, in Western Sydney. And this, as Paul was saying, for all, and we've both addressed, this will be an enormous economic catalyst. This is what we need to have: more jobs, more investment, more industry, more technology, and you can see we're pulling this all together with our Western Sydney City deal, which is the compact that we are finalising with the state government, with local government, federal government, working together to ensure that all of our investments and all of our policies are delivering that stronger economic growth that Western Sydney needs. And connectivity is a vitally important part of it. As you know, I'm a very enthusiastic devotee of rail infrastructure in Western Sydney, and so you can understand that we are looking at the options for rail very, very carefully, but with the aim of ensuring that the rail connectivity for the airport will ideally be commenced when the airport opens, and if not, as soon thereafter as possible. But that's the goal. But there's a lot of work to be done on the routes the different routes that are available for the rail connection, and of course we have to work very closely with stakeholders, landowners, of course, and above all the Government of New South Wales. So we are very, very committed to this. You know, you'll see many people call out and say, we want more infrastructure in Australia. That's good. We do too. But you've got to go beyond the headline, beyond the slogan. You've actually got to identify the projects that are going to get underway. And this is a case where the planning has been done, the plan is determined, and now the DA is in place, as Paul has said. It's all approved. And so now the offer, the notice of intention will be going to Sydney Airport Corporation. So we are moving along with this as quickly as we can and with absolute determination to deliver this vital economic infrastructure in Western Sydney.
Best case scenario, when can work out?
Well, the first point to make is that there's work underway, so there's demolition work on the site of the airport right now. There's work underway on the ground transport connection, so work's already underway, for example, on the Northern Road. There's a number of things that will be happening over the next couple of years. There's a high voltage transmission line that runs across the site. That needs to be undergrounded. That's a multi-million-dollar exercise. The Northern Road cuts across part of the site, so that needs to be relocated as part of the construction work. There's also some work we need to do to comply with conditions under the environmental impact statement that will take a period of time. For example, we've got to install some water monitors and let them operate for a period of time in addition to the water monitoring that's already been done. The next major phase will be the heavy earth moving. So the site is almost 1,800 hectares. There's variations of up to about 70 metres between the heights of different points of the site. That needs to be levelled. That will be a very major exercise. We're targeting having that work underway by the end of 2018.
What kind of interest have we had from airlines?
Look, the airlines are certainly interested. The airlines, more than anybody else, are aware of the issue of capacity into Sydney Airport to serve Sydney and other markets in Australia. So there is strong interest from the airlines in seeing this airport opening in the mid-2020s, and indeed Alan Joyce, Chief Executive of Qantas, was quoted, was in the media making that point this morning.
You mentioned a second runway is on the way for the Western Sydney Airport. Do you expect that to be any further construction, or that to be made bigger across the years, or is that as far as you're going to go?
The plan is to develop the airport in stages. So the first stage is a terminal with capacity for up to 10 million passengers. We expect to get to that point by the early 2030s, and that's about the size of Adelaide Airport today. In that first stage as well, the runway will be 3,700 metres. That is long enough to carry aircraft up to and including an Airbus A380, in other words, the biggest aircraft engaged in civil aviation, passenger aviation today. And so that means the airport will be able to support international flights and long-distance flights from the very outset. Now, there is space for a second runway. The planning is that that runway would be built when the airport gets to between 35 and 40 million passengers. On current projections, that won't be until about 2050. But the important point is the airport is being planned for future capacity expansion. It's very important we're taking decisions that allow Sydney's and Australia's aviation capacity needs to be met, not just over the next 10 or 20 years, but over the next 30, 40, 50 years and beyond.
Minister, a good worst case scenario, if SACL was to get control of both airports, wouldn't it be far better for everybody, government, business, people, if those two airports were competing, keeping prices down and everything parking to airline slots?
Look, the position is this: Sydney Airport Corporation Limited has the first right of refusal. That is their contractual right. and the government is scrupulous about honouring that right. We've been working very closely with them for over 2 years, and I do want to acknowledge and thank Sydney Airport Corporation Limited for the very extensive work they have done cooperatively with the government over the last 2+ years. We're now at a point where we will shortly, or certainly before the end of the year, we expect to issue the notice of intention to Sydney Airport Corporation Limited. It is then a matter for that company as to whether they wish to take up their right or not. Well, what I want to see happen is I want to see the government comply with our contractual obligations, and we will do that carefully and scrupulously.
Thank you all very much.